Good evening. Tonight I want to talk to you about a case that has shocked not just Hollywood, but the entire nation. A case that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, mental health, and the justice system itself. I'm referring to the tragedy involving Nick Reiner, currently held without bail, accused of the unthinkable murders of his parents, the legendary filmmaker Rob Reiner and his wife Michele Reiner. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. Everything I'm about to discuss is based on the limited information available to the public. Nick Reiner is presumed innocent until proven guilty. That's not just a legal formality. It's the bedrock of our justice system. But we can examine what we know, what might happen next, and what this means for everyone involved. Let me start with where we are right now. Nick Reiner sits in a Los Angeles County jail cell, denied bail. That decision alone tells us something significant. Judges don't deny bail lightly, especially in California. For bail to be denied completely, the court must believe either that the defendant poses an extreme flight risk or represents a danger to the community. Given the nature of these allegations, the familial relationship, and likely the evidence police have gathered, the judge made the determination that Nick Reiner cannot be released pending trial. Right now, as I speak to you, detectives from the Los Angeles Police Department are compiling their case file. They're organizing evidence, witness statements, forensic reports, crime scene photographs, digital records, phone data, and everything else they've collected. This package will be presented to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. And this is where the case enters a critical phase. The district attorney has several options, and each one leads down a dramatically different path. Let me walk you through what could happen when this case hits the prosecutor's desk. The first possibility is that the DA files first-degree murder charges. First-degree murder in California requires premeditation and deliberation. It means the prosecution believes Nick Reiner planned these killings, thought about them in advance, and carried them out with intent. If the DA goes this route, they're saying they have evidence that this wasn't a spontaneous act. Maybe there are text messages showing planning. Maybe there's evidence of preparation, purchasing weapons, or researching methods. Maybe there's a financial motive they've uncovered. First-degree murder carries 25 years to life in California. If special circumstances are alleged, such as multiple murders or murder for financial gain, we could be looking at life without the possibility of parole, or in extreme cases, though rarely pursued these days, the death penalty. The second option is second-degree murder. This is still murder, still intentional killing, but without the element of premeditation. It suggests that whatever happened in that home, it happened in the heat of the moment. Maybe an argument escalated. Maybe there was a confrontation that spiraled out of control. Second-degree murder still carries 15 years to life, so we're not talking about a light charge by any means. But it's a fundamentally different narrative about what occurred. There's a third possibility that many people don't consider initially, but it's important. Voluntary manslaughter. This would apply if the prosecution believes Nick Reiner acted in a sudden quarrel or heat of passion. California law recognizes that sometimes people act in ways that, while inexcusable and criminal, arise from circumstances that cloud judgment. The sentence for voluntary manslaughter is substantially less, 3 to 11 years. Now, given that we're talking about two victims here, given the denial of bail, this seems less likely. But prosecutors sometimes charge what they believe they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, not necessarily what they wish they could prove. Then there's the question of mental state. And this is where things get complicated. If Nick Reiner's defense team presents evidence of mental illness, of a psychotic break, of an inability to understand the nature of his actions or to distinguish right from wrong, we could be looking at an entirely different legal proceeding. California recognizes the insanity defense. If successful, it doesn't mean someone walks free. It means they're committed to a state psychiatric hospital until they're deemed no longer a danger. That could be years. That could be decades. That could be the rest of their life. We also have to consider the possibility of a plea bargain. Most cases, even serious ones, even murder cases, never go to trial. The system simply cannot handle trials for every case. If Nick Reiner's attorneys believe the evidence against him is overwhelming, they might negotiate with the DA for a lesser charge in exchange for a guilty plea. This might spare the families, including any surviving relatives, the trauma of a trial. It would provide certainty. It would close this chapter more quickly. But it would also mean that many questions might never be publicly answered. Now, let's talk about what happens next in the immediate term. The DA typically has 48 hours from the time of arrest to file charges, though this can be extended if the suspect is already in custody. Given the complexity of a double homicide case, given the profile of the victims, the DA will take time to review everything carefully. We're likely looking at arraignment within the next week to 10 days. At arraignment, several things will happen. Nick Reiner will appear before a judge. He'll be formally notified of the charges against him. He'll enter a plea, almost certainly not guilty at this stage. The judge will address bail again, though given the earlier denial, it's unlikely to change. Then we'll have a preliminary hearing scheduled, typically within 60 days for defendants in custody. The preliminary hearing is crucial. It's where the prosecution must show probable cause that a crime was committed and that Nick Reiner committed it. They don't have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt yet. They just have to show enough evidence that the case should proceed to trial. The defense gets to cross-examine witnesses. They get to challenge evidence. And critically, they get a preview of the prosecution's case. Smart defense attorneys use preliminary hearings to lock witnesses into testimony, to identify weaknesses in the state's case, to begin building their defense strategy. If the judge finds probable cause, and in murder cases they almost always do, Nick Reiner will be held to answer. That means the case proceeds to Superior Court. An information will be filed, essentially the formal charging document. Then there will be more hearings. Motions to suppress evidence. Motions regarding what can be presented at trial. Discovery disputes. Psychiatric evaluations if competency or sanity is at issue. This pretrial phase can take months, even years. Let me talk about the evidence for a moment. We don't know what police have, but we can make educated guesses based on how these investigations typically proceed. First, there's the crime scene itself. Forensics teams will have documented everything. Blood spatter patterns that might indicate where the victims were when they were attacked, whether they were standing, sitting, trying to flee. Defensive wounds on the victims' bodies that might tell us whether they fought back. The weapons used, assuming they were recovered. Fingerprints. DNA. Shoe prints. Fiber evidence. Modern forensic science can reconstruct events with startling accuracy. Then there's digital evidence. In 2025, our phones, our computers, our smart home devices, they all create records. Phone location data can place someone at a scene. Text messages and emails can establish motive or show planning. Search histories can be devastating at trial. Did someone Google how to avoid police detection? How to stage a crime scene? Where to dispose of evidence? Social media posts, even deleted ones, can often be recovered. Ring doorbells, security cameras, traffic cameras in the area, all of this creates a digital trail. There will be witness testimony. Who discovered the bodies? Who saw Nick Reiner before or after the alleged crimes? What was his demeanor? What did he say? Did he make any spontaneous statements to police? Those can be particularly important because they're often admissible even if someone later invokes their right to remain silent. Financial records will be scrutinized. Rob Reiner had substantial wealth. Was Nick Reiner in financial distress? Were there disputes about inheritance? About support? About property? Money is one of the oldest motives for family violence. Investigators will be looking at bank accounts, investment portfolios, wills, trusts, any recent changes to estate planning documents. And then there's the relationship history. What was the dynamic between Nick Reiner and his parents? Were there previous incidents of violence or threats? Had there been estrangement? Reconciliation attempts? Family members, friends, therapists if there were any, neighbors, colleagues, they'll all be interviewed. A picture will emerge of this family's inner life, and that picture might be very different from the public image of Rob Reiner, the celebrated director of films like When Harry Met Sally, The Princess Bride, A Few Good Men, and his decades of activism and public engagement. This brings me to something we need to acknowledge. This case involves a famous family, and that creates unique pressures and challenges. The media attention will be intense. Every hearing will be covered. Every filing will be analyzed. Public opinion will form quickly, often based on incomplete information. The defense will likely request a change of venue, arguing that Nick Reiner cannot get a fair trial in Los Angeles County where his father was so well known. Whether that succeeds is hard to predict. Courts are increasingly skeptical of such motions, believing that jury selection can filter out bias. The prosecution faces pressure too. The DA's office will be aware that the world is watching. They'll want to handle this professionally, thoroughly, without any appearance of either favoritism or unusual harshness based on the family's prominence. That's a difficult balance. On one hand, justice should be blind. Rich or poor, famous or unknown, the law should apply equally. On the other hand, human beings are making these decisions, and they're not immune to the symbolic weight of prosecuting the son of a Hollywood icon. Now let's consider the defense perspective. If you're Nick Reiner's attorney, what's your strategy? First, you're doing your own investigation. You're not just poking holes in the prosecution's case. You're building an alternative narrative. Maybe Nick Reiner has mental health issues that have been untreated or inadequately treated. Maybe there's a history of psychiatric hospitalization the public doesn't know about. If you can establish that your client was experiencing a psychotic episode, that he genuinely didn't understand what he was doing, the insanity defense becomes viable. Or maybe you're looking at diminished capacity. Maybe your client was under the influence of drugs or alcohol, not as an excuse, but as a mitigating factor that might reduce first-degree murder to second-degree or even manslaughter. Maybe there's evidence of abuse in the family history that never came to light publicly. I'm not suggesting there is. I'm laying out what defense strategies might look like. You might also be preparing for a trial where you don't actually dispute that Nick Reiner caused his parents' deaths, but you dispute the prosecution's characterization of how and why. Maybe you're arguing self-defense, claiming the altercation began differently than police believe. This would be difficult given two victims, but stranger arguments have been made. If the evidence is overwhelming and there's no viable defense, you're working on mitigation. You're preparing for the penalty phase. You're gathering evidence about your client's life, his struggles, any trauma he experienced, anything that might persuade a jury that despite this horrific act, he deserves some possibility of redemption decades from now rather than dying in prison. Let's talk about the victims for a moment, because in all of this legal analysis, we can't forget the human tragedy. Rob Reiner was 77 years old. He'd been making films for 50 years. He came from Hollywood royalty, the son of Carl Reiner. He'd given us movies that defined generations. He'd been married to Michele Reiner since 1989. She was a photographer, a businesswoman, involved in philanthropic work. Together they raised a family. They had grandchildren. They had plans. They had a life that should have continued. Now that life has been taken. A family has been shattered. Rob Reiner's other children, if Nick has siblings, they've lost both their parents and in the most dramatic way imaginable. They're victims too. They're grieving while the world watches. They may be called to testify. They may have to relive the worst moment of their lives in a public courtroom. The extended family, friends, colleagues who worked with Rob Reiner over decades, an entire community is mourning. And here's something that makes this even more complex. If the allegations are true, if Nick Reiner did kill his parents, then there are people who loved him too. Maybe he has children. He likely has friends who knew him as something other than what he's accused of being. Mental illness, if it's a factor here, doesn't make someone a monster. It makes them sick. That doesn't excuse violence. It doesn't minimize the tragedy. But it does add layers of sadness to an already devastating situation. What about the broader implications? What does this case tell us? I think it highlights several things our society still struggles with. First, mental health care in this country remains inadequate. If someone is experiencing psychiatric deterioration, if they're losing touch with reality, if they're becoming dangerous, we don't have good systems in place to intervene before tragedy occurs. Families often don't know what to do. The legal standards for involuntary commitment are high, perhaps appropriately so given our values around liberty, but that means people who need help don't always get it. Second, we're uncomfortable discussing violence within families, especially privileged families. We want to believe that money, education, opportunity, these things insulate people from the darkest possibilities of human behavior. But they don't. Domestic violence, mental illness, addiction, familial dysfunction, they cut across every demographic. A mansion in Pacific Palisades or Beverly Hills can hide the same suffering as a trailer in rural America. Third, we're seeing the collision of public life and private tragedy. Rob Reiner was a public figure. He had opinions. He shared them. He was political. And now his family's most intimate nightmare is being dissected in public. There's something deeply uncomfortable about that, even as we acknowledge the public's legitimate interest in understanding how our justice system handles such cases. Looking forward, this case will likely take years to resolve fully. If it goes to trial, we're looking at 2026 or even 2027 before a verdict. Appeals could extend it further. In the meantime, Nick Reiner will remain in custody. His life, regardless of outcome, will never be what it might have been. Even if somehow he's acquitted, even if there's some explanation we can't imagine right now that exonerates him, he'll be the man who was accused of killing Rob and Michele Reiner. That doesn't go away. The families affected will begin the long process of healing, though for some wounds there is no healing, only learning to live with the pain. Rob Reiner's legacy in film will remain, but it will forever be shadowed by how his life ended. That's unfair but unavoidable. People will watch The Princess Bride or Stand By Me with this knowledge in the back of their minds. The legal system will grind forward, imperfect but deliberate. Prosecutors will pursue what they believe is justice. Defense attorneys will advocate for their client. Judges will try to ensure fairness. And somewhere in all of that, we hope, the truth will emerge. Not speculation. Not rumor. Not what we think happened or what fits our preconceptions. The actual truth about what occurred and why. In closing, I want to return to where I started. Presumption of innocence. It's easy to forget that principle when we're confronted with horrible allegations. It's human nature to assume that where there's smoke, there's fire. But our system doesn't work that way for a reason. History is full of people wrongly accused, wrongly convicted, whose lives were destroyed by rushing to judgment. At the same time, we can acknowledge the overwhelming likelihood that something terrible happened in that home. 2 people are dead. Someone's son is in jail accused of killing them. Even as we wait for the legal process to unfold, we can mourn that loss. We can reflect on the fragility of life, the importance of mental health, the hidden struggles that families face. This case will be with us for a long time. It will raise questions about justice, about punishment, about redemption, about how we treat mental illness, about family dynamics, about so many things that make us uncomfortable. But those are conversations worth having, even when they're difficult. Especially when they're difficult. Thank you for your time tonight. I know this hasn't been easy to hear. It wasn't easy to discuss. But these stories, these tragedies, they're part of our shared experience as a society. How we respond to them, how our system handles them, that says something about who we are. Let's hope that whatever the truth turns out to be, justice is served, not just in the legal sense, but in the deeper sense of honoring the lives lost and dealing fairly with everyone involved. Thank you.